Hi, my name's Dale Carpenter, and you might not know me if you hadn't watched the e-learning that Tom and I did together for CWNP on CWS. But Tom asked me to come in here and talk to you just a little bit about roaming. Down there in West Virginia, where he and I grew up, roaming's all over the place. You're roaming up and down hills, roaming in hollers, roaming down the creek, and everywhere else. And roaming's an important topic, especially when you got a cell phone way back in the holler and you don't have a signal and your phone's continually just saying to you, looking for service. Well, I don't even know what it's looking for, but Tom can tell you more. At any rate, we're going to learn all about roaming in this session as we hear from Julio talking to us about roaming. And here he goes.
Hello everyone and welcome to the in and out of Wi-Fi roaming analysis. My name is Julio Petrovitch and I'm a product manager at NetAlly. So one of the first things you may be wondering when you saw the title of this presentation is, what's this about? Is this more of a in-depth Wi-Fi roaming analysis and packet capture thing, or something else? Well, reality is that today we'll be focusing on the fastest and easiest way to efficiently analyze and troubleshoot Wi-Fi roaming. So basically go in, do your thing, and come out. So quickly and efficiently analyzing and troubleshooting Wi-Fi roaming. That's the topic of today. That's what we want to focus on. And there's a few things we'll be covering here. First, we'll start with a little overview. And we'll go hey, how does basically roaming works? Well, the very basics, at least what you need to be able to efficiently analyze roaming problems. After that, we'll give you a few tips on, hey, tools that you need, basically what process should you follow while trying to analyze or troubleshoot roaming problems. We'll talk also about common root causes for roaming problems. We'll give you tips on how to solve those problems and also how to identify those problems. The idea, guys, is that, hey, analyzing roaming problems shouldn't take forever. It should be something simple and it shouldn't be as difficult as people think it is. So first, let's start with the very basics. How roaming works. So there's a few very basics that you guys should remember. I know many of you already know this, so this is not something new. But hey, things to keep in mind when you're trying to analyze roaming problems. First is, what does roaming mean on the Wi-Fi world? It's pretty straightforward, guys. It's that process of basically transitioning or moving a client device from one access point to another without losing the connection. That's as simple as it is. Notice though that that's not the same as moving from one access point, disconnecting, and then reconnecting on a different access point. That's not roaming. That's just getting disconnected from the network, which is one of the problems people doesn't want to have. Basically, the idea is that you need to transition from one access point to another without losing the connection on the network. That's what roaming is really about. Another important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about Wi-Fi roaming, and this one is a little, basically one of the pains of Wi-Fi roaming, is that client devices basically decide when to roam. It's not the access point, it's not the controller. Basically, client devices will look at the environment and they will say, okay, it's time for me to look for a new access point to move to. And normally they do that by using RSSI or signal strength. Many cases though, they may be a little smarter and use things like data rates or SNR, packet retry rates. So depending on the connectivity or the quality of that connection, they may decide it's time for me to look for a new access point to move to. Notice though, that even though the client device in the end makes the decision on where to move to or when to roam, the infrastructure can have some influence on that. And normally it's designed to help make that roaming process as seamless and quick as possible. And you guys have heard about all this before, but you have methods like fast transition roaming, you have assisted roaming, and you have BSS transition, or basically 802.11 RKMB in this order, or KBR if you prefer to say it that way. But basically, the main idea is that even though the client device makes a decision, the infrastructure can influence that decision or can help improve the quality of that roaming process. So remember, these are very basic things. We're not going down into the very depths of how roaming works. These are just things you need to keep in mind when you're troubleshooting or analyzing roaming problems. Then, now that you were able to refresh your memory on how roaming works, let's start digging into, hey, how do we efficiently and quickly troubleshoot and analyze roaming problems? Well, the first thing that you need to take into consideration is that you need a tool, or basically you need visibility. So it's not like, hey, you can go there and guesstimate or just look at where the access points are and determine when clients will roam, how efficient it will be, and so on. Regretfully, it's not that easy. You basically will need visibility. And for that, there's lots of different tools out there that can help you. Anything from apps on your phone or tablet to dedicated software or analysis software to handheld tools that basically will give you visibility on what's going on during that roaming process. And the recommendation, if you want to keep it simple and basically make the roaming troubleshooting process or analysis process as efficient as possible, is to have a tool that will give you visibility into things like the ones listed here. Anything from device discovery, basically, can you see all the access points in the area? After all, if you want to determine if a client is roaming correctly, you need to see what access points are out there. Not only the one the client is connected to, but the other candidates or to which it could connect to or roam to. You also need to know what the signal strength is. After all, like I mentioned a few moments ago, most clients will determine when to roam based on their signal strength or the RSSI. SNR is another one that's very important. Some clients, like I mentioned earlier, will determine when to roam based on the SNR on the environment. It can also help you identify other problems. Data rates is another important one. The quality of that connection. While I'm roaming, what's the quality of that connection? Or, hey, maybe that client device is just sticking to the same access point and the quality of the connection keeps degrading. Or like I mentioned, some clients will roam based on the data rates. Retry rates is another one. That's very important. Gaining that visibility on how many retries basically also shows you, hey, how the quality of that connection is degrading before roaming or during the roaming process. Connection quality. This one is a little more specialized. Not every tool will show you this, but it allows you to see more on a graphical type of format what the quality of that connection is while roaming or before roaming. Timestamps. This is an important one where you're going deep into the roaming process itself. And you want to see, hey, how long it took for me to, let's say, find a new access point. Or how long did it take this client device to reauthenticate to the new AP? So having those timestamps is very, very super important when you're troubleshooting or analyzing roaming problems. And then, of course, a detailed log file that shows you step-by-step what happened during that roaming process. If you get all this, or you have visibility into all this, you'll see it's a lot easier and even faster to determine what's going on during that roaming process and basically improve the analysis and troubleshooting of it. So Besides the required visibility or having a tool at hand that will provide that visibility, there's a few other things to keep in mind or that you will need. For example, you will need the right information. Let's say, for example, that, hey, someone is complaining, oh, in this specific area here, anytime I walk by, I get disconnected. So, hey, get more information about the problem itself. Where's that specific area? Is it in between access point 1 and access point 2? Or maybe it's between access point 2 and access point 3? Maybe it's all of the above. What exactly is happening? Are the client devices getting disconnected? Or is just the performance that's degrading when they roam from one access point to another? Basically, hey, find out more information about what the problem is, and that will give you some tips or ideas on what the root cause of the problem is. Like I mentioned, identify the problem area. Like, hey, where is the problem happening? Of course, there could be the case where it's happening everywhere. That's pretty bad, but it could happen. But hey, for troubleshooting purposes, try to identify a problem area to analyze or troubleshoot instead of having to walk around the entire building, which could take a while. Know your infrastructure. This one is important. If you want to know if your, for example, client device is sticking to a single AP, or if you are expecting that client device to, let's say, roam from one AP to AP1 to AP2, you need to know where your APs are at, or know your infrastructure. Is AP1 here? Where is AP2? Where is AP3? So basically, hey, know where the access points are, and basically have an expectation on how that roaming should work. And of course, this may sound like super basic, like, why am I mentioning this? But basically, you also need any connectivity credentials. So as part of the roaming analysis process, the most efficient way of seeing what's happening is by connecting to the network. So you'll need connectivity credentials to do that. So make sure you have those at hand. That way you don't spend time going around asking people, hey, how do I connect to a network? What's the passphrase? And so on. So now that you have the right tools to provide the visibility you need, you talked or asked around and saw, hey, or have better understanding what's the problem here, where the problem is happening. You need to determine if there's really a problem. Hey, you'll be very surprised that many times, or a lot of the time, people blames the Wi-Fi as basically the reason their network connectivity is down. It's, oh, Wi-Fi is down. Oh, there's no coverage here, and so on. And many times it's not really the Wi-Fi. It could be a problem on the wired side of the network. There could be a configuration problem on the client device itself. So hey, let's first validate that there's really a problem before you dig down and spend time trying to analyze and troubleshoot a problem that doesn't exist. And how do you do that? There's a few different ways. Number one, easiest, quickest way, and this will give you a lot of information, is to use the same client device for which the problem was reported. Is if you have access to it, of course, that may be the problem there. But hey, just use that same device and just walk around and see if there really is a problem. It's completely possible that you won't be able to reproduce the problem, or maybe you will. Another thing to do here, besides using the problem device or a device that's seeing the problem, try to use a second device. I don't know, let's say your phone or tablet, or a second voice over IP basic batch, for example. Use a second device and see if you can duplicate the problem with a different device. If you can, hey, that tells you that there might be something going on here. If you can't, they may tell you, there's maybe not a problem with the network itself. It may be a specific client device that's having a problem there. And then, of course, after you validate with the problem device itself or device that's seeing the problem. The second device, it will be a good idea to validate the same with your test tool. Whatever you decide to use, it could be an app, again, it could be dedicated software or dedicated handheld tool. Basically, go out there and see if the test tool sees the same problem. Many of these tools will allow you to just basically act like a client device. So they will allow you to connect to the network and basically just walk around, and they will roam like any other device. The difference here is that, or the advantage really, is that they will log information on what happens during that roaming process, which is what we want. And if you're able to duplicate the problem with your test tool, then yeah, there might be something going on here. So let's say that you went out there and you were able to duplicate the problem. You're like, wow, yeah, there's something going on here. It's not only the end user's device, it's not only the badges. Even with my little test tool, I was able to duplicate the issue. So how do you identify the root cause of the problem? Well, for today, we'll cover a few of the most common root causes for Wi-Fi roaming problems. And we'll start with signal coverage. And notice that there's two parts here. There's such a thing as too little coverage, although not as common anymore, surprisingly. And then there is such a thing as too much coverage. And funny enough, this seems to be a more common problem these days, at least on enterprises, than lack of coverage. Another part, of course, or another root cause that we want to highlight today is reauthentication. What happens during that process and taking too long, for example. And then we'll finish with mismatching AP configuration. This one is not as common as it used to be in the past, but it still could happen mostly on small businesses. So let's dig into it. So first, let's start with the very basics. This is like the thing that everyone should expect would be a problem for Wi-Fi roaming. And that's too little signal coverage, or basically not enough coverage, or commonly known as coverage holes. So why is this a problem? Well, let's say that your phone is connected to access point 1. You start walking. As you farther you get out, the signal strength becomes weaker and weaker. So your phone decides, okay, it's time for me to look for a new access point to connect to. If you don't have enough coverage, the problem will be that your phone won't be able to find an access point to connect to. Best case scenario, it will take a long time to find an access point. Maybe if you keep walking and walking, you'll find one at last and it will roam. That will, of course, affect performance of any conversations you're having or data transfers or file transfers and so on. Worst case scenario, it won't be able to find an AP to roam to on time. And as soon as it gets too far from the access point it's connected to, well, they will lose the connection to a network. Another thing that could happen here, and this one is a little weirder. Basically, let's say that you're sitting at a desk. Your phone is connected to access point 1. And the signal of access point 1, let's say, is at, I don't know, minus 67 dBm on your cube. And because of the way Wi-Fi works, that varies. It could go to minus 68, it could go down to minus 66, minus 65, as you move around, shift, and so on. So what happens there is that since you're on that borderline, and let's say that this phone of yours has the tendency of roaming on minus 67 dBm. Since you're on that borderline there, the signal keeps going up and down. While you're sitting there, your phone may try to find a new access point to roam to. Then let's say that it finds another access point. And that access point basically has a signal of minus 66 dBm. So it's better than the minus 67 that triggers the roam. So the phone will try to roam to that other access point. But again, because of the way Wi-Fi works, that signal may not be like minus 66 all the time. It may go down to minus 68, for example. And at that time, the phone will look for a new access point again. It will try to roam again. And if there's no other options in there, it may try roaming to access point 1 again. So basically, it will end up in this infinite loop going back and forth, where it goes between access point 1, signal goes a little too weak, let's move to access point 2, signal goes a little too weak, let's go back to access point 1. So basically, it's not only about not being able to find an AP to roam to, it's also the possibility of ending up on this eternal jumping around, or trashing as they call it, between access points when you don't have enough coverage on your network. So pretty nasty things could happen out there. So how do you identify if you're having problems with not enough coverage on your Wi-Fi network? This one is pretty simple. You can even do this with an app on your phone. But basically, the idea is that you have to validate what the RSSI, or signal strength, is throughout your network. Recommendation is to have at least 3 access points covering the same area with a minimum of minus 67 dBm. You'll say, why 3? Well, yes, you always want the backup. So make sure that at least, hey, minus 67 dBm everywhere on the site, at least have 2 or 3 access points covering each area on the site. So there's always a backup, or always an access point to roam to. And hey, again, like I mentioned, pretty easy to validate. Just take your preferred tool and just measure the signal strength. If you want something a little more graphical, that will show you what the coverage looks like instead of having to walk around and look at the numbers. You can also perform what's called a site survey, which will basically give you this heat map or graphical representation on how the coverage of your network looks like. So pretty straightforward to validate if you're having problems with too little coverage. As for how do we fix problems with not enough coverage or too little, there's a few options here. One, you could try using antennas with a higher gain. This may not be possible all the time if you're using internal antennas, for example. But if you have the option of using antennas with a higher gain, that could help. Of course, if the problem is very bad, like you have a big area with not enough coverage or no coverage at all, you could also add extra access points. Be warned here, don't go too crazy with the access points though. Adding too many access points will cause a different problem, which we'll be talking about in a few moments. The idea again is that, like I mentioned, there should always be a second AP covering an area with a stronger signal. So if you're connected to AP1 and you start walking, signal goes beyond the roaming threshold, there should be at least one more AP in that area with a stronger signal for the client device to roam to. The idea again is not to end up with a dead zone where the client won't find anywhere else to move to. Ooh, also a little note here. Some of you may be like, well, what about increasing the power on my access points? That may help. It depends. If you increasing the power may help on some cases where, for example, hey, a few dBs may make a difference. So you increase the power a little to increase that coverage in there. Still, same as adding access points, you need to be careful. Going too crazy and cranking up the power on your network will cause different problems. And that's where we're going next. Basically, what happens when you have too much coverage, or how does that affect roaming? Well, the first problem is what's called a sticky device. Basically, let's say I'm connected to AP1. AP1 has the power cranked up all the way. So you start walking and hey, still connected. The client device is like, well, still a good RSSI here. And you walk past AP2 and you're still connected to AP1. Then you walk past AP3 and you're still connected to AP1 and so on. I've seen cases where sometimes you can walk past 8 access points and still be connected to AP number 1. Problem with this is that one thing to remember is that it's not only about the signal strength of the access point, it's also about the signal strength of the client. Remember that client devices also need to transmit and their power is limited. It's not like you can crank up the power on your phone or your tablet, for example. So you may end up in cases where the client sees the access point as having a great signal still, so there's no need to roam. But the access point can't hear the client anymore. So basically, you'll start basically getting retries, the data rates will go down, and the performance will be like pretty bad. Mostly because even though the client can still hear the access point can't hear the client anymore, or at least is having problems hearing it. So the performance will become pretty bad. Another thing that could happen here, besides the sticky clients, is cases where you have too many access points in the area, all with high power. So you're connected on AP1. You start walking, signal strength gets to a point where the client device decides, okay, I need to move to a new access point. So let me look in the area and see what's out there. And then it finds multiple access points, all of them with a strong signal. Let's say for this example that we have here on the screen, we have, for example, 2 other access points, both of them with a signal of minus 60 dBm, which is more than what I currently have on the APM connected to. Problem is like, okay, so these 2 APs both have a stronger signal, but they also have the same signal. So which one should I move to? And basically what will happen here is that the client device will take longer to decide to which access point to move to. And are there ways to prevent this? Yes, and we'll be talking about those in a few moments. But basically, this will delay the roaming process and affect the performance of that roaming process. So if you're having, let's say, voice over Wi-Fi call, you will see some delays or interrupts, or basically, let's say you have a video conference, you may freeze while you're roaming because the client is taking longer than expected or than it should while trying to decide or find an access point to roam to. So important details here, guys. 1, excessive coverage, very bad. Sticky devices, very bad. Always take into consideration that it's not only the signal strength of the access point, but also the signal strength of the client device. So excessive coverage is a problem. And also remember that most clients will decide when to roam based on signal strength. So if you have too many access points with strong signals all over the place, it may make it a little more difficult for clients to decide when to roam or where to roam to. So how do you identify problems with too much coverage? Pretty straightforward, very similar to the process we described earlier when you have too little coverage. Any tool that provides information on signal strength or RSSI could help. Again, it could be an app, it could be dedicated software, it could be handheld tool, it could be a survey tool. Basically, you need to go out there and measure the signal strength on the problem area. Things you want to look for. 1, you want to make sure that you don't have more than 3 APs on each area with a very strong signal strength. For example, in this screenshot I have here, we can see a few APs And there's a lot of them that have fairly strong signals, and a bunch of them that have the same signal strength, which is a problem we were describing earlier. So technically, you'll end up with a lot of problems while roaming on this example network we have here. The idea is to make sure that you have enough APs to cover the area and make it easy for client devices to roam. Not too little, and like in this case, not too much. If you find that you have 10 access points in the area, all with minus 65 or stronger signals, that may be a little excessive in there. Or if you find that you can see the access point on the other side of the building and it has a signal strength of minus 67 dBm still, that may be a little excessive too. You may want to start lowering the power on those access points. So how do you solve problems with excessive coverage? One thing you could do is enable 802.11k or B. When we talked earlier about clients having or taking too much time trying to decide to which access point they want to roam to, well, 802.11k or B can help. And yet there's some debate on how useful 802.11b is, but at least 802.11k, where the access point, hey, can make recommendations or at least give you a list of access points in the area you could roam to. So it makes it a little easier for the client to decide to which access point to roam to, even on environments where there's multiple candidates. Of course, you could also lower or disable the lower data rates. So for example, let's say you're using, 8 and 12 Mbps data rates. Hey, you could disable those. That will force the client devices to basically disconnect or basically look for an AP to roam to sooner. So if you're cranking up the power on your access points and you want to prevent client devices from sticking to the access point, one thing to do, disable lower data rates. So they'll be forced to find the new access point sooner rather than later. Of course, lowering the power on those access points may also help. So you may want to take that into consideration. There's no need to be blasting the air if you have lots of access points in the area. That will really help with sticky devices. Of course, if you, let's say it this way, over-designed the network and you ended up with lots of access points and excessive coverage, another thing you could do, although it's a shame to do this, is turn off some of those Wi-Fi radios that you're not using. Of course, if that sounds like, man, I already paid for all this stuff, I don't want to turn them off. Well, then you could also convert some of those radios into, let's say, intrusion sensors or spectrum analyzers or packet capture analysis tools. Basically, hey, do something else with them. The idea is to lower that excessive coverage. So you have enough coverage, but not too much. Okie doke. Moving on to the next topic here. So that was coverage. Now, the other common problem with roaming is reauthentication. And this normally happens on environments or where it's a little more prevalent, at least, on environments where you need to move from one system to another pretty quickly because of the type of applications you're using. So if you're doing video conferencing while moving around, or voice calls, or transferring big files, basically reauthentication could be a problem in those cases if it takes too long. Why? Because those applications are sensitive to time or timing. So if you're, for example, in a video conference and there's a, let's say, 600 millisecond interrupt while you reauthenticate from one access point to another, then yeah, you will notice that on the call. Worst cases, the call will drop because basically you got disconnected for 600 milliseconds. Same thing will happen with file transfers and so on. So if you're using applications that are time sensitive, basically UDP type of applications, then you need to make sure that that roaming not only happens, but happens quickly and efficiently. And problem here, like I mentioned, is that depending on the type of authentication you use, it could take a very long time, not only to move to a new access point, but reauthenticate and reestablish that connection. Basically, you need it to be aware of the latency that is caused by the reauthentication process. And here in this little graph, you have we show it to you. Basically, you're connected, for example, to client one. You have client one connected to your old AP. You're sending and receiving data. Then you decide you want to roam to a new AP. So you start probing, looking for a new AP. The new AP replies. You're like, okay, transmit more data. Then I need to reauthenticate and associate to a new AP. And then I have all the EAP process, basically the authentication process that will happen before I can start sending data to a new AP. So this roaming time here can be incremented by a lot depending on the type of association or authentication process that you're using. And mostly common with EAP type authentication. So if you're using EAP, basically you could encounter this problem with latency sensitive applications. So how do you identify if you're having problems with the reauthentication process taking too long? Well, pretty straightforward, really. Again, you need a tool that will provide visibility. And in this case, what you want is a tool that will tell you how long it took for each step of the roaming process. So keep that log that will show you, okay, I started looking for an new AP at X time. Then I found one. Then how long it took me to connect to it, how long it took me to reauthenticate, and then how long it took by the end or the total roaming process. So having that log that will tell you, hey, how long it took me to basically complete the roaming process, or more importantly, reauthenticate, that's the type of visibility you need. So, hey, go to the problem area. Someone is complaining, just go there, take your tool with you, make sure you configure it to use the same authentication type or EAP type that's being used, and then just go through the process of roaming. Just walk around and see what happens and measure how long it takes. Notice that if the entire roaming process is taking more than 100 milliseconds, that is a problem there with latency sensitive applications like the ones I mentioned earlier. You always want to make sure that that roaming process takes less than 100 milliseconds. So recommended solutions. Number one, enable 802.11r. 802.11r can help with this. Basically, what will happen here is that, shown here in the little graph, you have client here connected to AP number one. And what will happen is that, hey, the client will determine, okay, it's time for me to roam. Let me look around and see which access points are available. And then, okay, they will say, okay, this is a good candidate. Let's say client access point number two. So two things could happen here. One, it could send a message to access point number one, telling it, hey, I'm planning to roam to access point number two. Can you send can you do part of the authentication for me? So when I roam there, I don't have to go through the entire process. Or another option, the client could directly talk to AP number 2 and tell it, hey, before I roam to you, I want to send you some of this authentication information I got here so you can validate it before I roam. And then AP number 2 will have that authentication information ready. So when the client roams over to AP number 2, it doesn't have to go through the entire authentication process because it already completed part of it ahead of time. And this will cut down the total roaming time by a fair amount. So enabling 802.11r, very recommended. Notice little detail here that for this to work, both the AP and the client need to support 802.11r. So if you're using, let's say some IoT devices or a client device that doesn't support 802.11r, this won't work. So in that case, you could try using some other vendor proprietary fast roaming options if they're available. Or you could try using, let's say, an open network or WPA2 personal type of network. Notice that that's not very secure. So depending on the type of environment, you may want to make sure that, or use a dedicated VLAN or a dedicated SSID for those non-secure devices that don't support 802.11r, and if you want them to work efficiently on the network. Let's example, guys, mismatching AP configuration. So this one is not as prevalent anymore. It's pretty rare these days, really. But it still could happen mostly on small businesses. So what will happen here is that, let's say, for example, that you have a small network with 3 access points. And hey, you don't need a controller to configure 3 access points. So you manually configured all 3 of them. And you made a typo on one of them. Let's say, for example, that the passphrase was incorrect on one of them. So in a case like that, a client device could be connected to AP1. As you move along, the signature will get weaker. It will start looking for a new AP to roam to, and it will find AP2. And AP2 is the AP in which the passphrase was entered incorrectly. So the client device will say, okay, this is the same SSID, so I should be able to roam here. But when it tries to do that, it can't authenticate. So the roaming will fail. Another case, let's say, again, small business, you have 3 access points. But in this case, instead of making a mistake on the passphrase, you make a mistake on the SSID. Basically, you end up, let's say, with a different character or uppercase versus lowercase, etc. Same thing will happen, or something similar. You're connected to AP1, you start walking, you want to roam to AP2, but it's not the right SSID. So you keep looking for another AP that has the right SSID, and let's say AP3 is farther out. So 2 things could happen here. This is the same as not having enough coverage, technically. One, the roaming process could be delayed until the client can see AP3, or you could get disconnected because you won't make it on time to where AP3 is at and reconnect there. So mismatching configuration could also cause problems with roaming. Also notice that even though it's rare, this could also happen on enterprise environments where you have multiple controllers and each controller was configured separately or by different people, for example. So how do you identify problems with mismatching AP configuration? Pretty straightforward again. You just need the right tools to give you that visibility. And there's 2 methods here. For small businesses, you could, for example, have a tool that just shows you the details of how an AP is configured, what that SSID is, what type of security is being used, data it's supported, etc. And you can just validate each AP one by one and see that everything matches in there. On a bigger enterprise environment, that may take a while though, because you'll have to go one AP at a time and look in through all of them. So in that case, you may want something that basically identifies the problem by itself. The idea is to make it a little easier. Again, we're talking about going in and out as soon as possible. So being efficient about troubleshooting and analyzing Wi-Fi roaming problems. So a tool that will basically identify this type of problem automatically will make it a lot quicker for you, at least on an enterprise environment. Small businesses with just a few APs, just being able, you can do it manually if needed. Recommended solutions, of course, if your network is big enough, having a centralized management system or controller that configures all the APs the same way is the safe bet. If your network is small enough that the controller will be like overkill, trying to use configuration profiles will help. This is basically, hey, you configure AP1, you export that configuration, it will generate a little file that you can just import into the other APs. That way you have the same on every AP. Anytime you do things manually, there's a risk that there will be a typo or a mistake. And then of course, if you have to do it manually and configure each controller manually or each AP manually separately, then hey, do some validation. Double check your work all the time. Also, since we're talking about configuration, I added an extra tip down here for you guys. But one thing to keep in mind is that some client devices don't like roaming on hidden networks, or at least it doesn't work very well for them. So if you're on an enterprise network and you need roaming, highly recommended that you disable hidden networks. Remember, well, as many of you know, hidden network doesn't really do anything for security. So unless you have a good reason to have the network hidden, reality is that you should just make the network visible. And that will also help with roaming for some client devices. So anyway, guys, in conclusion, Wi-Fi roaming problems don't have to be difficult to troubleshoot or analyze. With the right tools, the right visibility, hey, and a little knowledge, of course, you should be able to resolve Wi-Fi roaming problems quickly and efficiently, or basically go in and come out. And that's all I got, guys. Thank you very much for your time today. And I'll talk to you all again soon.
Okay, I'm here with Julio live. Julio, how you doing today?
Hey, pretty good. Thank you for having me.
Good. And I just want to let everybody know, I don't know how Dale snuck in here, but he's gone. He won't be showing up the rest of the day, so no worries. Julio, you're talking about roaming, and obviously a very important issue within our enterprise wireless networks.
Yes, indeed.
And there was a question that came up about the whole issue of hidden SSIDs and preference for unhidden SSIDs and so forth. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I sure can. So as mentioned on the chat, each vendor does their own thing on how the client device will decide when or why to roam. And as part of that, some vendors or some devices, for example, I think yesterday we were talking about the Apple devices and what their best settings on their network are for them. And Apple devices don't really like roaming on hidden networks, for example. So on the question that came up where you had an SSID, if the client device needs to decide between a network where the SSID is hidden and another one where it doesn't, it will normally perform better on a network where the SSID is not hidden. Of course, again, it's different for every client type or chipset. Sometimes it's different for different drivers. So there's no perfect science on that one, since every vendor does their own thing. There's no standard.
Yeah. And I actually spent some time a few years ago gathering every Linux driver source code that I could get online, and looking through the source code to see how they addressed roaming, if they did in their driver. A lot of them left it up to default configurations in Linux, and some of them did customize it a bit, but there was great variety in how they did it there as well. And so, yeah, roaming can vary a lot from one client to the next, can it?
Oh, yes, indeed. Even from one version of, like you said, driver or firmware from another, even using the same client. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, Julio, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for joining us live today so that everybody can get a chance to see you. And glad that you're well. Take care and stay safe, okay?
Yep. Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye.